Hello everyone, my name is Saurabh. I am the co-founder and CEO of Nonstop AI Technologies Private Limited. We started Nonstop around 9 years back, and we have been developing Flutter-based mobile apps pretty much since Flutter began. Today, I have Mr. Pavan Podila with me, and we are going to talk about the framework that he has built. So, Pavan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Why don't you start introducing yourself, and then we can dive into what you have built and why you have built and how it can be utilized for, say, overall mobile app development.
Sure. So, as you already mentioned, my name is Pavan Podila, and I actually started a company about 6 months back called Vyuh Technologies Private Limited. And before that, I was with Tata Digital, where I was running as the chief architect for almost 3 years. And there, we actually saw a bunch of different problems building super apps. And this framework actually was born out of some of the ideas and stuff which we developed internally over there. And my whole experience has been building applications for the past 20 years for almost Fortune 500 companies. I started, in New York as my first company when I went there for my master's. And then I spent about 10, 15 years, about 10 to 12 years maybe on Wall Street, building a lot of different apps for the big giants over there. And then we switched to retail for a couple of years, and then finally with Tata Digital, where we spent time building the super app. So a lot of my experience is around creating these giant applications. It's not the first super app that I built at Tata's, but apparently the ones before that also were super apps. We just didn't know the name at the time. And I have written a couple of books, 2 books to be precise. I'm a GD for Flutter and Dart.
Okay.
And I also done a couple of apps which were on the App Store for some time. And I dabble a lot with technology.
Right.
So that's what I've done so far.
Awesome. And it's, I think, something huge milestone that you have achieved in your career. So you talked about super apps. So can you walk us through in terms of what is a super app first, right? And what are the fundamental thought process behind when somebody tackles such a problem?
See, I think first we need to define what a super app is. And people have different definitions of super apps. So super app, in my opinion, is just a collection of different disparate functionalities packaged inside one application. So a lot of the apps that you see today, like say Swiggy, Zomato, Amazon, and many more which are out there, they all started by focusing on a singular problem. Let's say do e-commerce or delivery or food delivery or something of that nature.
Correct.
But as they grew into a much larger entity, they realized that there's a lot of allied services which also help the customer, which could be coupled with their own offerings.
True.
So although they have a primary offering, let's say food or delivery or whatever, there are a lot of allied services which can also help the customer just because they have built a trust with this brand. So a super app is born when you realize that it is no longer just a single business functionality or a core offering that is useful to the customer, but there's a lot more that the app can do, and it all needs to be packaged together. Because the customer is not going to download a second app or a third app.
Correct.
Once you have more offerings to give.
True.
So it's better to kind of put all of them into a single application, and then at the entry point itself, you go into different areas of the application. So a super app, in my opinion, is just a collection of different functionalities. They may be related or not related. And it's just a packaging all of them into singular experience so that for a customer it is easier to track what's happening with their different orders or different parts of the application and so on. And in case specifically about Tata Neu, things are a little different, and I'll get to that a little later.
Sure. You mentioned that for a super app, maybe it starts with one particular product problem that they want to solve, and then slowly the business as it evolves. So when you build Vyuh, right, what were the fundamental thought process that you kept in mind that these are my, like, sort of like a checklist which I'm going to tackle so that anybody who builds super app using Vyuh should be in the right place to do it?
Right. So the framework, of course, has to solve some fundamental problems of software engineering. And when you start building large apps, the immediate problems you will see is how do you manage a large team? Because gigantic apps cannot be built by 1 or 2 people.
Correct.
And of course, if you have a small team which is building a very big application, then kudos to you because it's a rarity. But generally, it will take a much larger team to build these kind of apps, which means these teams have to operate fairly independently. And as far as possible, if they don't have too much of stepping on each other in terms of day-to-day management, it becomes easier for them to build their own features and deploy them independently. Now, when it comes to super apps, traditionally super apps will have a primary vector in terms of what is the core offering.
Correct.
And a lot of secondary vectors which point in different directions, which are all allied services.
Correct.
Now, if you look at the primary and the secondary, there is very little overlap usually. So it is a natural use case to kind of develop them independently. So you can build the primary separately with a separate team, build the secondaries with a separate team, and do it in a very independent manner. So the software process that is required to build an app of this scale requires you to think in a very decentralized manner. It is not a monolithic team. It is not a monolithic software.
Correct.
It is not a monolithic repo also sometimes. You may have multiple repos building different parts of your application, but the app that is shipped to the customer is monolithic.
Correct.
So you combine and compose everything into a single app, but the development process can be very fragmented.
So what you're
and when I say
suggesting,
fragmented is in a positive way, just so that accelerated development can happen in each direction without depending on each other.
So are you suggesting each different team can build their own set of apps or features separately in a modular way,
Yes.
and then combine it? Is that what Vyuh does?
So I think what you want to do is kind of get into this composable state of building applications. So rather than building one singular piece of application, you build your application as a collection of modules. And so you enforce modularity from day one.
Right.
Now, traditionally, if you don't have a framework like Vyuh, and we'll get into what Vyuh actually gives you all out of the box also. If you don't have a framework of that nature, the architectural underpinning required to think in those aspects requires you to have very seasoned folks who have done that in the past. And most teams may not have that out of the box because hiring such people is always very difficult. Hiring
is always a big problem.
So how do you go about deciding your architecture and what is the architectural pattern for building an application of this scale? So modularity has to be an inbuilt thing.
Correct.
The question is, how do you do it? The second question would be, who controls what part of the application?
Correct.
So very super apps are very generally content oriented, which means the content is not sitting in the application.
Correct.
Which means there has to be some kind of a team which is managing the content and some team which is probably creating the visual experience for it.
Yes.
And these two teams have to be a little disconnected in the sense that they can operate independently without stepping on each other or relying too much on each other. Because as you increase the overhead between these two teams, the super app development becomes slow.
Correct.
So you have to create a system where things can be built independently, things can be done in a decentralized fashion, and you also want remote control so that as things change and you have more updates to process and update and push to your customers, they can also be done without requiring special ceremony with the engineering or anything.
Right.
So those are all the fundamental principles. Let's go fast as much as possible, and let's depend less on each other. And whenever possible, we'll combine our efforts to show the final thing.
Right.
The customer doesn't know that it's actually being built by so many different teams.
Then
they see a singular product that's coming out, but how you build it is an engineering process which has to be changed.
Correct. So the way I understand is, so the Vyuh is right now helping teams to build super app in such a way that they can build it independently, right? So I can definitely see that this is one big problem for any mobile app development or any product development team, that they may not get the right folks at the right point, right? What are the other set of big problems which generally a customer face while building super apps? And then maybe you can get into what are the features of Vyuh which tackle these problems.
Yeah. So, if you look at the teams which are building the super apps, they traditionally will have to take a set of use cases and then combine them into creating some design system for it, some visual experience for it.
Correct.
And then coordinate a lot with the design teams to make sure the things are getting implemented properly.
Correct.
Now, if you have 10 teams doing the exact same thing, it is an overhead for the design team, which is normally the same, let's say, for all the different teams. Or it could be a pod which is embedded in the team itself.
Right.
So one of the things which you want to kind of eliminate in a super app development process is the overhead. So you would probably create a small team which has its own design team, its own engineering team, and a dedicated set of use cases to build. And you build it in a manner as if you don't know about the other teams.
Correct.
So you be completely independent in that manner.
Okay.
And the problems people face is that there's a lot of dependency in terms of I need their API, I have some components which they are building also.
Correct.
So maybe I should just share it with them and things of that nature.
Hmm.
And traditionally, you can start being different. But as you start scaling up, you realize that there's a lot of duplicates in your system.
Yeah.
So you need a governance body to ensure that this duplication is eliminated.
Correct.
So it's a big problem actually when you start creating large teams. You will create these governance layers just to make sure there's not enough duplication. There is some consistency of quality, design, and engineering efforts which are the same across the teams. And more importantly, talent can be shared across teams. So if you have pockets of talent with different skill sets and they are not already operating in a similar manner, then it's very difficult to kind of take help from a different team.
Okay.
Because you may have juniors and seniors maybe not equally distributed.
True.
Let's say one team has a lot of seniors and one team has a lot of juniors.
Yes.
The junior team will obviously struggle to some extent. But the senior team, since they're happy in their own ecosystem, they were not willing to help them out so much.
Exactly.
Like, why bother? Right?
Correct.
So you need to have an equal distribution of senior junior talent just to make sure that there is an equalizer across the teams.
Correct.
No one team is more super than the other.
True.
Even though you're building a super app. Right? You don't want super teams.
Yeah.
But if you have super teams, let all of them be super teams. So equalizing the talent across the teams is a big concern for the organization.
Correct.
Because they want to also transfer the people back and forth.
True.
And it is very natural for any organization to have a rotating door, right? People come in, people go.
Yes.
So if you can keep your quality levels at a certain check, then it becomes easy to sustain your engineering efforts as you keep adding more people, people moving between different teams and so on and so forth. So I think the people problem still exists, whether you are building super app or not. The overhead between teams still exists.
Correct.
And between the consistency across engineering efforts, quality and design is also one of the big problems.
Correct.
And these three coupled together as a combined problem in general, but you see them called out like this.
True. So how does Vyuh is exactly helping solve this problem?
So one thing we did in the Vyuh framework is that we want to embrace modularity from day one, which means you are not constructing a single app.
Correct.
You want to think in terms of modules, which every team can work on independently.
Correct.
And more importantly, we realized that although you can modularize your super app process or super app development process, the journeys are still embedded inside the module. So people tend to create, let's say, a login journey.
Correct.
So you will have a team which is managing authentication and login, let's say. So they'll start by creating the entire login process, login journeys, which will include the phone screen, the login screen, then you have phone, OTP, check-in, you submit the OTP and then you get a confirmation, then you move on to the home screen, let's say.
Okay.
And in the process of login also, you could face other issues in terms of forgetting a password,
Correct.
or making other forms of authentication methods and so on.
Yes.
Right? And during login, there's a lot of branding that is required. Because that's the first time the customer is experiencing the product.
Yes.
And this branding can change seasonally.
Correct.
Right? Now, who manages this branding? Is it the login team or is it the business team?
Good question.
Right? So ownership of responsibility, even in a very simple screen like login, is not clear.
Correct.
Right? The business team can say today that, okay, I want to see a very nice brand logo and some animation or something playing while the customer interacts with the form. But for a sale event, if that happens maybe a few months down the lane, the same login screen can look different.
Correct. Yes.
And it is natural for a lot of retail e-commerce apps to have a different login experience depending on the time of the year.
Correct.
If some festival is going on, you actually want to show festival hues in your login screen.
True.
But the control for that is normally the engineering team.
Yes.
So the business has to change something. They have to now fall back on the engineering and tell them, hey, make this change. And let's make sure we deploy the app in time, avoiding all the App Store, Play Store review process. So it's in the hands of the customer as quickly as possible.
Correct.
That's one side of the problem.
Yeah.
The other side is the customer doesn't always update their apps on time.
Correct. Never.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can always deploy your all changes and be happy that okay, everything went out in time.
Yes.
But your customer is actually not updating their app.
Correct.
They may have turned on automatic updates.
Yes.
So although you're saying, I have great experience for you in the login, customer will never witness it.
Never witness it. Correct.
So how do you deal with this situation? There has to be something done differently over here.
Yeah.
You cannot rely on a development process where every aspect of the pixel requires an App Store release.
Correct.
So you have to kind of get rid of that process. Right? And so the Vyuh as a framework allows you to define these things in a manner where things can be changed on the fly without requiring an app store release.
Okay.
So it's an important principle actually in the process.
Awesome.
At the same time, modularity is required.
Yes.
At the same time, you also need other things like being available on all the platforms, because
Always
it reduces
required.
the amount of manpower and
Correct.
cost you need to use to kind of build such applications.
Mhm.
And finally, production applications are very different.
Yes.
They have lots of capabilities built out of the box. And if you can somehow let the teams focus on their own business functionality rather than the plumbing required to build the app, it will give them extra time and benefit of the built-in facilities rather than focusing on things which are already there, and instead focusing on the business functionality.
Right.
And these are the core ideas of the framework.
Okay. So then, can you take us through the actual features that one gets? So something out of the box functionalities that Vyuh is providing right now.
Yeah. So let me just reiterate the feature set in terms of a manner that probably makes more sense.
Yeah.
So modularity. How does it translate? Right. So what we do in the Vyuh as a framework is that we divide the application into a set of features.
Okay.
And in fact, the application is a composable unit of features.
Okay.
Each feature is independent of each other. And a feature represents a set of content blocks.
Okay.
Which represents some visual aspect of the content. Because ultimately your app is just a collection of content.
Correct.
Organized across pages and some navigation and journeys to help the customer navigate this content. Right. So let's take the example of an e-commerce. Right. You start from a home screen. You do some search, see the results, then add to cart. You view the product, the details, and so on. Add to cart, check out, and so on.
Correct.
Now that's a standard journey. Other apps like news or in EdTech will have similar journeys, which are very relevant to their domain. Now, today, if you want to build a feature, you can think of the feature as including those journeys as well as the content blocks. But one main difference that we added to the framework is that we don't focus on journeys. We instead only focus on the content blocks necessary to fill a page or render a page.
Okay.
The journey management is extracted out. And I'll tell you where it goes.
Okay.
But it's not part of your feature.
Okay.
So your feature's responsibility is only to expose content blocks, which could be API-based content, built-in content, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So that's how we embrace modularity.
Correct.
And now the aspect about journeys, who manages it, we have pushed that to a separate system, which is your content management system.
Okay.
Or a CMS.
Yeah.
Now, CMS traditionally has been used to create websites.
Correct.
And most people, when they hear about CMS, they think about WordPress.
Blogs
and WordPress. Right?
Correct.
So it's natural for them to think that, okay, how can CMS help in building apps?
Correct, yes.
But the world has changed in the past 3 years in terms of headless CMSs. What used to be a system purely for building websites has morphed into being very generic and not really having any connection with the presentation layer. And that's why these headless CMSs can be used to manage content of all kinds.
Correct.
Content for apps, content for websites, content for other kinds of systems, even kiosks and TVs, for example.
Okay.
So they don't care about where you show the content. They only care about managing this content for you.
Correct.
And give you all the necessary capabilities to manage this content. In terms of CDN, images, describing relationship between content blocks and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So what we realized is that if we can leverage the CMS as a way of managing these journeys, and then use the app purely as a rendering layer, where the features tell me what needs to be shown on the app and how they should be exposed on the CMS.
Right.
I can construct a journey on the fly on the CMS.
Awesome. Okay.
So this gives you the abilities for the business actually wants to not depend too much on the engineering for very simple changes like, sale event versus not sale event, changing the experience on the login screen and so on. And the engineering teams can focus on building specific components which can be configured on the CMS but rendered on the client side.
Got it.
So now the responsibility of a team reduces to just building components or content blocks. It is no longer about creating everything, journeys plus API calls plus connection management and this and that and all that.
Okay.
So you have somehow raised your level of abstraction by focusing more on what you need than how you actually build it.
Right. Okay.
And this way the framework helps you accelerate your efforts in creating super apps or apps of any kind.
Great.
That's the two basic concepts.
So modularity and content.
And
server-driven
UI. CMS-driven ability to drive your journeys and so on.
So now we have very smartly used CMS not just for the content but also for driving the journeys.
Exactly.
Right. And you have also segregated what does the engineering team should be doing and what business teams can do, or rather what they could do and you can do around there.
And in fact, this makes the ownership very clear.
Correct.
Right? So the business is purely focused on experience, purely focused on what the customer has to see.
Correct.
Engineering focus on how they should be seeing it in terms of painting the pixels, managing the performance, making the API calls, etc., etc.
Correct.
Which is not the purview of business.
Correct. Yes.
Business focus on what needs to be shown, not how. Engineering has to focus on the how.
Right.
So you give them their ownerships in a very clear, distinct manner, so that as a team you can operate and work faster.
Right. So now, when it comes to engineering teams, so typically when a mobile app that you see, right, it is not just how it looks like. There are a lot of things that go behind it, right? There is authentication part, there is network, storage, a lot of things that engineering team has to do. Is Vyuh offering any help for the engineering team that is already taken care of, say, out of the box?
Yeah, so the capabilities which are common across all the features, we call them as plugins. So features and plugins become the two building blocks, or the two pillars of the framework.
Okay.
Features is what the user sees, and is what the development teams will use to build the user experiences.
Okay.
And plugins are the underlying plumbing and capabilities which are useful to all the features. Okay. So authentication, storage, networking, error management, permissions, notifications, and integration with other third-party integrations like APIs, etc.
Okay.
Those are all exposed in the plugin layer.
Okay.
And you're free to add more plugins, which are obviously required in case of certain businesses. And that again separates responsibilities in terms of what the feature has to do and what the plugin has to do. Let's take the example of authentication since you brought it up.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the authentication layer, it includes a lot of screens. Login, maybe enter OTP,
correct,
confirmation,
yes,
forget password, or not receiving OTP, etc., etc.
Correct.
That's the experience layer.
Yes.
That is managed by the feature.
Okay.
But internally, the experience layer has to call into someone to actually do the job.
That's right.
That layer is the plugin layer.
Okay.
So when you, let's say, type in your phone number and you say get OTP, that get OTP is actually calling into the plugin layer and talking to the authentication plugin and making the request to fetch the OTP.
Okay. So now if I want to change that, say from Google authentication to say Microsoft authentication, then all I have to do is just change the plugin.
Just change the plugin and just change your call happening into the plugin.
Excellent.
So as a team, you are not concerned so much about the specific plugin that you're using, but the fact that an authentication request is being made.
Okay.
What type of request is it? Whether it's an OTP-based request, social auth-based request, etc., is just an implementation detail.
Correct. Okay.
And the teams are now raising the level of abstraction in terms of focusing more on the authentication as a service that the feature uses.
Okay.
So there's a clear separation again. So you can continue improving the experience on the login side, maybe adding animations and those kind of things.
Okay.
That does not impact the plugin layer. And tomorrow, if you want to introduce new plugins, new ways of authenticating, it's just an extra buttons and stuff showing up on the feature.
Okay.
And with the subsequent calls happening to the plugin layer.
Excellent. So you talked about features and how plugins are being displayed. What is the tech stack that Vyuh is using today?
So that again is a very interesting question. When we started, there was a need to kind of combine different teams. Previously, we were running on iOS team separate, an Android team separate, and a web team separate.
Okay.
And the immediate problem we saw was fragmentation of efforts.
Yeah.
Each team was building it differently. It was actually the same feature being built on all three platforms, but each built in a different way.
Yeah.
Some platforms had bugs, some did not. Some features worked really well on iOS, but some did not work on Android. Some worked very well on Android, but failed to work on iOS.
Okay.
And the skill set was not getting shared across teams. Although they were doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
The screens looked almost similar on all the platforms, but the code was not the same. Skill sets were not the same. The teams were not the same. So we were actually doing the same work 3x times.
Okay.
Which is obviously too much of an overhead for something, as a company like whatever we're using on.
Okay.
For any enterprise, that's actually a concern.
Yeah.
So we decided to go with a cross-platform toolkit, which will save us these efforts.
Okay.
And the 3x fragmentation becomes just one way of doing things, which allows us to share talent, share skill sets, share the code, more importantly.
Right.
You find bugs once, you fix them once. Right? So as a company, you're doing only things once and not duplicating the efforts across teams. Hiring also becomes easier. Correct. Because you're only hiring for one skill set.
Yes.
And teams who are junior, people who are junior, they'll grow into become more senior within a standard skill set. So it's not like you're fragmenting your ecosystem in terms of tech stacks.
Correct.
And choosing something that remains with you for a longer time. So in that regard, we chose Flutter as our primary cross-platform toolkit.
Excellent.
which at the time seemed like a very bold decision. In hindsight, it seems like the right choice because Flutter has improved and matured quite a bit in the past.
Definitely does. Yes. So what else? I mean, like, is it just Flutter that it's part of the tech stack, or are there any other components?
So Flutter was used for the experience layer, and the CMS layer, which as you mentioned earlier, that again was a bit of a discovery for us. There were a lot of CMSs in the market which were claiming to do headless CMS.
Right.
Many of them had typical problems like using a drag and drop builder to create schemas.
Right.
I mean, the way CMSs work is you define schemas, which describes your content in terms of structure and attributes and so on. And then you create instances of those content in the CMS application. Now, the way you define the schemas was quite different across all the CMSs.
Right.
If you choose a drag and drop builder, then you would have to drag and drop all the schemas literally forever for creating more complex content.
Correct.
And that obviously was not palatable for a large team. They're also operating independently.
Right.
And no, they won't have a single studio, they will need multiple studios.
Correct.
So dragging and dropping things was not an option. So we wanted a CMS where you could write your schemas in code. Okay. And because if you do that, you can even git control the schemas. You can have somebody review it.
Correct.
And before it gets checked into the main branch, somebody can actually approve that okay, this is the right thing to do. Doing things in a drag and drop manner doesn't give you that ability.
True.
Because now there's nobody to review.
Yes.
Right? Anybody can do anything and then it just shows up on the CMS.
Correct.
So that approval process was a very important one. And more importantly, we realized that if you have 10 teams, you need 10 instances of your studio, the CMS studio.
Right.
And most other CMSs required different deployments.
Correct.
Just to get an instance out. And that was not always straightforward.
Right.
Cost was a big factor. And then also management of all of these instances.
Right. Okay.
So after a lot of research, we landed on Sanity as a primary CMS.
Okay.
Which allows us to do schema development in code.
Right.
Which allows us to create as many instances of the studio as you want.
Right.
Per team. Because everything is running locally. The React Studio, which is used to manage the content, is just a client shell that talks to a cloud data set in case of Sanity.
Okay.
So your data is still sitting in the cloud.
Right.
But you have a very simple studio interface to manage the content inside the studio.
Right. Okay.
Right. So this flexibility allows us to work with lots of teams, lots of different instances, without paying a very high cost of managing all of this.
Excellent.
So Sanity was a choice we made after almost 3 months of research.
Okay.
And we've seen the CMS market has not changed so much, and Sanity still seems to be a primary player over here. Right. Number one on the Gartner quadrant.
Wow. Excellent. Yeah. So the way you have explained is that now your content management system not only has the content in it, but you have very smartly also put in the journeys inside it, right? And because of the schema, which is as a code, literally, if correct me if I'm wrong, entire Vyuh could be even said in a very simplified terms of Terraform as an app building way.
You could.
So so does the approach of a mobile app developer change when he or she uses Vyuh?
Absolutely, it does.
Okay.
Because we're introducing a few other ingredients into the development process now. You no longer just have Flutter, but you also have a CMS as a companion. Now, what that makes you, in terms of a developer, is that you have to now think in terms of the pure content that is being rendered on the screen.
Correct.
It is no longer about simply creating widgets, making API calls, and then stashing everything together and building up the final experience. It's about separating what is it that needs to be shown, how much of configurability do I expose on the CMS for managing this content, and then how do I bring it back into the Flutter experience in terms of rendering it.
Okay.
Right. So, because the features that the teams are building, they don't include any journeys.
Right.
Although you still could, you're not moving away from that. But typically, you would not want to do that because that takes away the flexibility from the business. So you are only exposing content, content set of blocks.
Right. Okay.
And that means each block will have its own schema, which is available on the CMS, and its corresponding counterpart on the Flutter side that renders that content block.
Okay.
So this is a shift in thinking, and you might think, okay, how does it help me build large apps, which are very complex and so on?
Yeah.
Well, it just happens to be a stitching of multiple content blocks of different types. API content blocks, traditional content blocks of buttons, accordions, video players, and so on, and journeys which are actually constructed on the CMS. So pretty much any experience you can imagine can be built in this fashion, It's just that it breaks down the components into more granular aspects, which are managed independently.
Right.
And the responsibilities are very clear now. Who owns what?
Correct.
And teams are only creating features are only exposing components, which are the rendered versions of the CMS content.
Correct.
And business manages the CMS.
So if I'm not wrong, if certain developers are creating certain components and now it has become a completely reusable component, it's the time overall to develop the app must have been reduced, right?
Yes, because now
how much can you quantify by any?
So typically, if you don't have this process,
Mhm.
let's take a different approach, right? I mean, imagine the framework does not exist.
Yeah.
Typically, you would go out creating the content and the experience together.
Yeah.
And that immediately, gives away the control of the experience away from the business.
Correct.
Because business cannot manage the journeys anymore.
Yes.
They cannot manage the experience.
Correct.
And changing anything requires you to obviously talk back to the engineering teams.
Correct.
Moreover, modularity is not always easy to do.
Yes.
I mean, you can say you can divide yourself into packages, but who owns this package?
Yes.
And what is the output of a package?
True.
And how do you combine all these packages to create the final experience?
Yes.
Those are still unanswered in terms of important questions.
Correct.
So if you are doing it the traditional way,
Mm-hmm.
you probably be spending a lot more time. And I'll at least save you 30 to 40% of your time by adopting this approach where you've broken it down into more simpler components, clear responsibilities between different teams,
Right.
also making teams independent of each other, and then combining things together when ready.
Okay.
So rather than doing everything as one big block of development, you've broken into multiple small pieces and then combining things together. So easy to 30 to 50% of time savings is what you're seeing.
Okay.
It could be more depending on how you organize yourself.
That's a significant number.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Using Vyuh framework, what all different platforms are already taken care of?
So as I said, Vyuh is built using Flutter right now.
Yeah.
And Flutter on its own supports multiple platforms.
Correct.
iOS, Android, web, desktop, and multiple flavors of desktop like Mac, Windows, Linux, and even Raspberry Pi.
Correct.
Although I'm not sure how many will actually use it. But the point is, I think wherever Flutter is there, we can also be present. So Vyuh naturally supports Android, iOS, web out of the box.
Okay.
And more will get added and with better support for plugins, those kind of things.
Okay.
Now, moving forward, we may have native support for web also.
Okay.
As in not using Flutter to render the web application, but using traditional web technologies like React, Next.js, and Astro, and things like that.
Okay.
To get a more native feel for building web applications.
Okay. Excellent.
So it will happen, but right now, even today, it's supported on the web and other platforms.
So three major like mobile for
iOS,
Android, iOS, and web are already taken care of.
Already supported. If that's not enough, and you want a more native direct path to rendering on the web, that is also coming a little later.
So Pawan, you mentioned that as part of the tech stack, you are using Flutter for Vyuh, right? I think the moment I hear Flutter, the next question comes to my mind: why not React Native also? So, and is Vyuh going to support React Native in the future?
Well, that's a very valid question. And if you're an enterprise trying to adopt Vyuh, it will be a likely question to ask because they may already chosen React Native as their tech stack.
Yeah.
Right. And so some of the benefits of Vyuh might be appealing, but the tech stack choice may not be as appealing to them. So as of today, Vyuh is meant for Flutter because that's what we started with. And we're already seeing enough of a market need where people are building apps in Flutter.
Yeah.
All the new age apps at least are getting built in Flutter, and maybe an existing app which could have made a choice of using React Native for whatever reasons will obviously remain with React Native. If there is enough of a client demand, we will obviously even build a React Native version. And now actually we are even seeing a demand for web. So we might even explore building Vyuh for web.
Excellent.
So it will happen based on how the market tells us. And how quickly they tell us.
Right. How about Shorebird? Is that also in your pipeline to integrate?
See, Shorebird is a very interesting piece of technology. One thing you miss out with the framework, the Vyuh framework, is that if there are very core logic changes or a fundamental change to the rendering of a component or a design system, it still requires you to go through the App Store process.
Yeah, okay.
So you can't get away from it.
Yeah.
Whereas with Shorebird, one of the things benefits you get is that including logic changes and changes to any of the experience layer can still be sent as a over-the-air update.
Okay.
By patching the customer device.
Correct. Okay.
So if you combine Vyuh's abilities to have dynamic journeys, dynamic experience changes coming from the CMS, including the logic changes which can be deployed through Shorebird. It gives you a very nice system where pretty much any change you normally do in an application can now be deployed without going to the App Store. So for an enterprise, I don't think it is just about Vyuh. If you combine that with Shorebird, I think you get a very interesting combination of techniques to deploy without requiring the App Store.
Okay.
So I would say it's a companion or complementary product.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. One might think that since you are using Sanity as a CMS and there is still a drag and drop part of it, would you by any chance put Vyuh into the category of no-code, low-code tool?
Yeah. So if you look at traditional low-code, no-code tools, they are the same tool which is used by business and engineering.
Correct.
So one of the parties has to compromise.
That is right.
If it is no code, the engineers are complaining, where is my code?
Yes.
Because some things cannot be done in no code.
Correct.
However hard you try.
Yes.
I mean, you may try to compartmentalize everything, but the life is not so forgiving. So you'll have to create something in code, and that requires going back to an IDE. So no code has some limitation. It can probably get you to a certain state, but beyond that, you have to dig down into the code.
Correct. Yes.
At the same time, if you go to the low code side, the complete full code side, business tends to lose.
Yes.
Because then they don't have any understanding of how to write code.
Correct.
And they don't actually want to write code even if it's a low code tool. Because coding requires a different mentality, different style of thinking, a shift in mindset from the traditional way of managing components and drag and drop things to create the screens.
Correct.
So even if you have a low code tool for a business, it still requires a lot of training to make sure they use it effectively. Because then they can introduce other kinds of bottlenecks and performance issues and so on. Right. So either party tends to lose depending on the choices to make about low code or no code. What we decided to do is do neither of them.
Okay.
In fact, we call this as pro code.
Pro code.
Neither no code nor low code, but it's pro code.
Okay.
And what it means is that we are pro for the engineers as well as pro for the business guys. So as I said, we have two counterparties when you're building an application, right? We have CMS and we have the engineering teams building the corresponding components.
Correct.
So they get the full code benefit. So they are getting the pro code benefit.
Yes.
Whereas the business teams, they are relying on the CMS to drive their entire operations, which is a no-code tool for them.
Correct.
But they get the power of a pro-code tool because anything they do has its manifestation on the client side.
Right. Okay.
So it seems like magic where they are not intervening so much in doing anything. And wherever it requires a engineering intervention, there is the teams taking care of that through the content block.
Okay.
And these guys are only configuring things.
Yes.
So configuration is the max extent of their usage.
Correct. Yeah.
And the tool itself is so simple that they don't really get bogged down by the complexity of managing all the different aspects of a UI interface, screen design, managing the box shadows and pixels and other kinds of things, right?
Right.
These things are irrelevant to the business teams. They want to focus on what is the content and where it needs to be shown. And to whom.
Right. Okay.
Right. And that is taken care of by the framework well within the CMS domain.
Got it.
And the app takes care of rendering it with the right intents.
Correct.
So I think each party gets its benefits.
Yes.
So it's no code for business and full code for engineering.
No code for business, full code for engineering. So essentially, it's a completely new paradigm shift that we're talking about.
We try to call it the pro code paradigm.
The pro code paradigm. Excellent. What are the industries you think would benefit immediately by adopting the Vyuh framework?
So Vyuh is primarily meant for industries which are content oriented. So the examples would be retail, of course, because almost everything is content over there. News and media, which tends to publish a lot of news articles. Your news is the content, which keeps changing on a regular basis.
Yes.
Real estate, where your property is being added constantly. And of course, it is also very content oriented. And then you have education, which is also having a lot of content, courses, trainings, managing the users, and so on.
Correct.
And if you look at other similar businesses, where content becomes the centerpiece, I think Vyuh would be very helpful to them.
Okay. And I think as a final question, I want to understand why the name Vyuh. Can you elaborate on that?
So Vyuh is actually a Sanskrit word.
Yes.
Which means formation, arrangement, strategy, and so on.
Correct.
And if you know Mahabharata, there is a thing in Mahabharata where you have this Chakra Vyuh.
Correct, yes.
Which is a specific formation of soldiers.
Yes.
In order to trap the enemy.
Correct.
It has a one way in, but there's no way out.
No way out. Yeah.
So that was how one of the brave warriors got
Yes.
trapped and eventually killed.
Yes.
So Vyuh is not intended for any of those purposes. It's not an entrapment of clients, but primarily a formation and arrangement of technologies to solve specific problems in the enterprise world.
Right. Great.
So, our extent remains in technology only. No harm to any living soul.
Excellent. What are the next steps you think that you are going to do as part of the framework?
So clearly, integrations is a big piece.
Okay.
As I said, plugins is one fundamental part of the framework.
Yes.
And we do have fundamental frameworks. Plugins like authentication, storage, etc. But the market need is more than that.
Yeah.
For example, video integration.
Correct.
Or integrating with specific systems like Firebase, Superbase, and so on. So those will be on the cards for the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
And we are in active development to build those. In addition to that, I think as we see more use cases in the market, we'll probably create additional helpers, features to accelerate your process of building things. And maybe even adopt a different platform, like you said about web and React Native.
Oh, nice.
So those are the big immediate needs, I would say.
Great. Thank you so much, Pavan, for spending time with us and talking about Vyuh. To the viewers, I would recommend to go and check out the Vyuh framework and see how it helps you to build your super apps as well as any other mobile app. Thank you.